Okay then, so hopefully by now you understand some of the basic concepts of Vue, and you can see how we can create a Vue component to inject dynamic data into our template, how to use methods to react to different events in a browser like click events or other mouse events, and generally just use this component to control a certain section of our web page. But that's all we're doing at the minute, just controlling a certain part of the HTML page. And that's fine if that's all you want to do, just create a one-off widget which you can drop into your website. But ultimately, I'd like to show you how to create full websites with Vue.js, whereby we can inject multiple components and have multiple different routes or pages as well, all controlled by Vue. Now, to do that, we have to set up Vue in a very different way than we have done so far. At the minute, all we do is just link to the Vue CDN in the head. But for Vue to power full web applications, we'll need a bit more setup. And for that, we're going to use the Vue CLI. And CLI just stands for Command Line Interface. Now, don't let that put you off. It's not complicated, and I'm going to show you exactly how to use it. But essentially, this is a tool that we can use to boilerplate full Vue applications, which come along with all the configuration and structure that we need to create full Vue websites or single page applications. Remember, we talked about SPAs or single page applications earlier in the course, whereby a single HTML page is sent back to the browser from the server, and then Vue takes control of the whole application from then onwards and injects whatever components make up the website into the HTML page. And that is the kind of website we'll be creating with the Vue CLI. Now, when we use the Vue CLI, it will also provide us with some other benefits as well. For example, being able to use modern JavaScript features which are not natively supported in browsers, and providing us with a live reload development server to preview our website on, so we don't need to use the live server package we've been relying on so far. And it also minimizes all of our code for when we build it for production, which results in a better performance. So in this chapter, we'll be installing the Vue CLI and using it to create more complex and fuller Vue applications, and then later we'll also introduce the idea of using multiple routes or pages as well. First up, we'll install the Vue CLI and use it to create a blank Vue project. Before we do anything else, in order to use the Vue CLI, you'll need Node.js installed on your computer. Now, you don't need to know anything about Node, we just need it installed so that we can use the Node package manager to install the Vue CLI. So to do this, head to nodejs.org and click on the download button right here to get the latest version. Once it's downloaded, click on that and go through the install wizard, and that will install it on your computer. Now, to check it's installed correctly, you'll need to use the command line. Now, you can use whatever command line tool you want. On Windows, you can use command prompt if you wish. If you're on a Mac, you can use the terminal. I'm going to be using one called Windows Terminal, which is free to download for Windows as well. Now, inside this, you need to type node space -v and then press enter. And if this gives you back a version number, it means Node is installed correctly. If not, it means it's not, and you'll have to close this down and try to reinstall it again. So now we've got Node installed, we can use the Node Package Manager, or NPM for short, which comes along with the install, to install another package, and that is the Vue CLI. And we want to install this globally on our computer so that we can use it anywhere and we can create a Vue project in any folder on our computer. So to do this, to install a package with NPM, we say npm and then install. And if we're installing something globally on our computer, which is what we're doing, we say -g, that means to install it globally, and then the name of the package. In our case, it's @vue/CLI. So this gets us the CLI from Vue. And if we press enter, it's going to install that package for us on our computer. Okay, so now that the Vue CLI is installed, we can use it in the command line to generate Vue projects. So first of all, we need to make sure we navigate to the directory on our computer that we want to make this project in. Now to do this, you can type cd to change directory to go into a folder. For example, I'm currently in the Sean folder. If I want to go into the documents folder from here, I can say cd space documents like so, and that goes into the documents folder. If I want to go back up a level, I can type cd space ... and that goes back up a level. So I'm just going to go back into the documents folder, then I'm going to cd into a tuts folder, and then this is where I'm going to create my project. So to do this with the Vue CLI now, all we need to do is say Vue create and then the name of our project. I'm going to call this modal project because as we learn, we're going to be creating a web modal. So once you've done that, press enter. And by the way, the reason we can use this Vue command is because we have that Vue CLI package installed on our computer now. So press enter to create this project, and it's going to ask us a few different questions. So first of all, it's going to say, do we want to use the default setup, which is Vue 2, the default setup for Vue 3, or manually select features? Now I'm going to go with manually select features, and then down here we can select which different features we want. So we want to be able to choose the Vue version, so we keep that selected. We'll keep bevel. I'm going to press the space bar on the linter to deselect that because I don't want that for this tutorial, and then I'm going to press enter. So now I want to choose a version. The version I want here is version 3, so press enter on that. And then we want to place our config for Babel in a dedicated config file, so press that. Do you want to save this preset for future projects? I'm going to press no, and it's going to generate this project for us. Okay then, so that's all created for us. Now, if we want to open this project in VS Code, first of all, I'm going to cd into the new project directory that it's created for us inside this tuts folder. So cd and then modal-project. And it says here, run npm run serve. We're not going to do that from here. I just want to open this project up, this folder that we're currently in VS Code. So if you have VS Code installed on your computer, you can just type code space and then full stop and press enter, and this opens this project directory that we're currently in VS Code for you. If you prefer, you can just go into VS Code or whatever text editor you're using and open the folder manually, but I like to do it this way because it's quicker. So press enter and it opens up VS Code inside this project directory. So in here, you're going to see a load of different files and folders, and it might seem a bit complex at first and a bit overwhelming, but it's actually quite simple when you understand what everything is for. So I'll walk you through all of these different files and folders next. So when you first create a new Vue application using the Vue CLI like we just did, it can be quite daunting because it generates all of these different files and folders for us to make up this project. And you start thinking that using the Vue CLI was a bad mistake because it just seems way too complicated. But fear not, although it can seem complicated at first and there's a lot of files, once you start working with it and making more Vue applications, it becomes a lot less scary. So I'm just going to give you a quick walkthrough of what these files are all about, but don't worry if it doesn't sink in at first. The more we use these files, the easier it will become. So first off, the node modules folder at the top. This is where any libraries or dependencies that we use for this project are stored. In our case, the Vue library and the things it depends on are all kept in here. And anytime we install another package or library for this project, it's going to be placed in here. Now, you don't need to go in here or edit anything inside here. Now, the public folder contains the index.html file, which is sent to the browser initially. Now, this is the single page that makes up a single page application. And if we take a look inside, we can see there's virtually no content in the body. We have this empty div with an ID of app. And this is ultimately where Vue will dynamically inject component templates. Okay? Now, next up is the source folder. And it's inside the source folder that we write all of our source code. All of our different components, templates, and CSS are going to live inside here. Also in this source folder, we have this main.js file, and this is the JavaScript file that kickstarts our application. And it does that by using this create app method. Now, we also saw this method in the last chapter, but when we used it, we had to say view.createApp. We're not doing that right here. And the reason we're not doing that is because we're directly importing this function from the Vue library. So the way this works is that we're just importing the things that we need from Vue, and then we don't have to say view dot. It's the same kind of thing, but this import is grabbing this single function now from the Vue library, and the import automatically knows to look inside the node modules for that Vue library. So it grabs it from there and it grabs this function which we use. So we're doing the same thing, we just don't tack it onto the Vue object anymore. Now inside we're passing this app object, and this is a Vue component. Now before we directly added in a component using an object, and we added things like data and methods into that object. Now this is a very similar kind of thing, but this time we're not directly doing it here. Instead, we're importing a component from a Vue file. Now Vue files are known as single file components in Vue, and that's generally how we create Vue components when we work with larger projects. So now we're saying that this is the root component, which is then mounted to the DOM at this location, which is the div with an ID of app. And we can take a look at that again inside index. It's right here. So this is where the root component is going to be injected. So let's just take a little look at that app.vue file. And it looks something like this. We can see three things. It's got a template, it's got a script, and inside we have an object being exported, and this is very similar to the object that we created inside create app in previous lessons. We'll see more about that later on, but also at the bottom we have a style as well. And every Vue component or Vue file is made up of these three things, but don't worry too much about all of this for now. We'll talk more about Vue components and Vue files in the next lesson, but know that this is our root component that we're registering right here, okay? Below the source folder, we've also got a few more files. First, we have a git ignore file, and that is set up for if you want to use Git and GitHub in this project. There's also a Babel config file, which is configuration for our app so that we can use certain JavaScript features. And finally, we have packages files as well. Now, you won't need to manually edit any of those. They keep track of our different packages. You will find yourself referring to this one quite frequently though, package.json, because this will contain all of our dependencies, which we'll probably talk about a bit more later on, but it also contains the scripts to serve and build our application. So we're going to use this one now, in fact, and this is used to spin up a local development server so that we can preview our Vue application in a browser. So let me do that. The first thing we need to do is open up a terminal, and to do that you can go to terminal and new terminal, and down here make sure you're in the correct directory. It should be modal project or whatever you call your project, and then let's run this script. The way we run it is by using npm. So we say npm run and then whatever the script is called. In our case it's called serve. So let's do that. npm run serve, press enter. This spins up the local development server, and when it's done it's going to give us a link right here where it says local to open this in a browser. So I'm just going to control and click to open that in a browser, and it's appeared on my other screen over here. And now we can see this is our Vue application, and this right here, this content is what we saw in the app.vue file. And all of the templates in that file is being dynamically injected into the index page, which we get back. So if we inspect this, we should see it's all inside this div with an ID of app. That's where it's being output. So remember, when this HTML page is first sent to the browser from our local development server, this HTML page is empty for a split second. It just contains this empty div with an ID of app. But then Vue takes the app component and it renders it to the DOM inside this div element with the ID of app. Now I can demo this by adding a breakpoint in the JavaScript. So let me open up the sources, and I'm going to go to JS over here, and I'm going to go to app.js, and I'm going to scroll right to the top, and I'm going to add a breakpoint, meaning that the JavaScript now is going to stop here and it's not going to run. And if I refresh the page, when we get back, you can see it's an empty screen. And if I go to elements, we can see there's no content inside the div with an ID of app. This is the blank HTML page we get back. But then if we were to run the JavaScript, then everything is going to work and it's going to inject that component. All right, so that's how it's working. Now, all of this is happening behind the scenes by Vue, and all we really need to do is focus on creating components which we then want to render to the DOM. Okay, so hopefully now you've got a basic understanding of what these files are for and how Vue is injecting a component into the web page. Don't worry too much if it seems a bit complicated for now. The more we use these files as we go on, the more it will make sense, and you can always refer back to this video for reference. Next up though, we'll take a closer look at what this Vue file is and how we use it to create a Vue component. So this thing right here. So we've seen now that this main.js file is kickstarting the application, and it's taking the app component right here and it's passing it in as the root component to create app. Now we'll talk more about root components later on, but then it's mounting it to the DOM at this location. Now this right here, this is a Vue component and it's this file. So every Vue file represents a single Vue component, and it has the .vue extension at the end. And by the way, to get the syntax highlighting in here so everything looks good, make sure you have that Vito package installed. I showed you that earlier. If we go to packages, I can scroll down here and see it installed. It's this one right here. So make sure you search for it up here and install it. Otherwise, this might look a bit off. Now, every Vue component can contain 3 different parts. First of all, an HTML template. We create it here now instead of in the HTML page like we did earlier. Second, we have a script where we export the component object right here. And finally, we have a style tag for any component styles, any styles you want to apply to this template. Now, the script and the styles right here, they are actually optional, but every component must at least have a template. So first of all, let's talk about that template. Before, when we used the CDN link to use Vue.js, we created the template directly inside the index.html file, inside app right here. But this time around, we don't do that. We create the template for a component inside its component file. And the reason for that is that we might have many different components with different templates, and they might not all show at the same time inside the index.html file. So we can't directly hardcode the templates in here because, like I said, they might not all show at the same time. And also, it would mean that if we have many components, this would get very messy very quick. So we split up our templates into different components for different parts of our web page, and each component has its own template at the top. Then when we render that component to the DOM, its template is injected into the DOM. Now, the root tag must always be a template tag right here. This is a Vue tag, not a regular HTML one, but inside that you can organize your template however you wish. Now, one new feature of Vue is that you can have multiple root elements inside the template right here. It used to be that you have to have one root element which surrounds everything, but now, as you can see, there's 2 root elements. We have an image and this component, which we'll talk more about later on. Now, this works fine, but it used to be that we had to do something like this, have a div tag, and then we could place all of this inside of this div, right? That was the old way of doing it, but like I said, you don't have to do that anymore, which is really nice. You can have as many root elements inside the template as you wish. So this template right here, this is what we see in the page over here. Now, it looks a lot more on the page than we see right here, but that's because this in itself is a component which is being inserted into this component. Now, we're going to talk more about multiple components later on, so what I'm going to do is just delete this template for now and create our own simple template, which is going to be an H1, and I'll just say my first Vue app, and then save it. And when I save, the development server is going to auto refresh this in the browser. So we can see that the template has been updated, and now we see the new content on the page. Next up is the script tag that we see right here, and the first thing we do inside that is import this hello world component from the components folder. This was the thing that we saw inside the template earlier. Now that's coming from the components folder. We're going to talk more about multiple components later on, so I'm going to leave that for now. And in fact, we'll delete it because we don't need the hello world components inside this file anymore. Now, next we have this object right here, and we're exporting this object. Now, this object represents the root component, much like we represented the root component as an object when we used the Vue CDN in the previous chapter. It can contain things like data, methods, computed properties, etc. At the minute, this has got a name, and this is optional. You don't have to give your components a name, but in this case, we're calling it app. And then also, we have a components property, which is registering any extra components we're using inside this component. Now, again, we don't need this anymore because we're no longer using that hello world component. So I'm just going to get rid of that. Now, like I said, we can use data and methods inside this object, much like we did before. So if I want to make some data, I can just use the data function, which returns, remember, an object. And this object has a title property in our case, and that title is going to be my first Vue app, like so. And now, instead of hard coding this, we could just output the title instead. So let me do that, double curly braces, and then title. So the way we output data is exactly the same way in this template as we did previously. So let me save this and preview now of it in the browser, and we can see that is the new title right here. Awesome. So that works. So again, we'll work much more with this object as we go forward. And like I said before, it's actually optional to have this object, but most of the time when you make components, you'll find yourself needing data and methods for the component. So you probably, about 90% of the time, will use a component object. Okay, so finally we have this style tag, which is for the component styles. And you can see right here, we're styling the app div. Now that's not technically inside this component, but it doesn't matter because these styles are actually global. Even though they're inside this component file, they apply to any elements on the page. We can scope them just to this file, just to this component, but we'll see how to do that later on. So that's pretty much it. They're the three parts that make up our component. And I tell you what, actually, I'm just going to add one style down here for the H1 so you can see that this works. Let me do this, and I'll copy and paste these in so you don't have to watch me writing them out. We have a border bottom for the H1. We say display inline block and padding bottom. If I save that now, you can see now we get that border at the bottom and a bit of padding. All right. So when we render this component to the DOM, and remember, we're doing that inside the main.js file because we're saying the root component is app and we're mounting it right here. When that happens, all of this template is injected into the index file right here. And the styles right here, they are placed in the head. And we can see that if I inspect, we can go in the head and we can see some styles at some point right here. So these are the styles that we see inside the components. And you can see they're the new ones we just created, all right? Now, just very quickly, a couple more things. This assets folder, this is where we can place anything like images that we use inside components. And we saw before that we had an image up here and it was referencing this image right here. We will work with images later on throughout the course for different projects, but that's where they will go if we do use them. And secondly, again, we saw this components file. When we make multiple components, we will be placing them in there later on, but don't concern yourself too much with this for now. So there we go. That is a Vue component in a nutshell. So next, I want to quickly talk about another concept in Vue, and that is template refs. But just really quickly, before we do move on, I want to just point out one important thing to do with the course files from this point onwards in the course. If you're downloading any of the course files from this lesson onwards, there's one more step you have to take once you've opened up the project inside VS Code, and that is to install all of the project dependencies. So all of the project dependencies that live inside Node modules, they are not inside the GitHub repository files. So what you need to do is download those files, open up the project inside VS Code, and then you open up a terminal and you type npm install, and that will install all of the project dependencies listed inside the package.json file right here. And only then, once you've done that, will you be able to run the project by using this command right here, npm run serve. If you try that before doing the install, then it's not going to work. So again, make sure you run npm install once you download the course files before you try to run the project from this point onwards. Alright, so before we dive too deep into creating these larger Vue projects and multiple components, I just want to talk for a minute about something called template refs. So sometimes when you're working with Vue, you might need to have a handle on a DOM element. Now, in regular JavaScript, we would use something like the query selector to grab that element, and then we can manipulate it if we need to. We could add classes, remove classes, change its content, etc. Now, the way we do this in Vue is not by using the query selector, but instead we use template refs. Now, template refs allow us to store a reference to a DOM element inside a variable. Then when we have that reference, we can use regular JavaScript methods and properties on it to do things like change its classes, text content, its styles, etc. So how do we use these template refs? Well, let's do an example. I'm going to create an input field and I'm going to give this a ref of name. You can call it what you want, it doesn't matter. Now, if I want to get a handle of this, I can just use this ref that I gave to it. So what I'm going to do is add a button as well. And I'll say click me here, and I'll attach a click event to this button. So @click is equal to a function I'm going to call handle click. Now down here we need our methods property. Remember, this is how we add methods to a component, and I'm going to create that handle click method that we invoke when we click on this button. So inside here, all I'm going to do is try to get a handle on this input, and the way I do that is by using the ref. So I could say console.log, and I'm going to use this to refer to this component, much like we did before. If we want to use the data, we'd say this.title. When we're using refs, we say this dot, and then it's $refs. And now I can access on that refs object any ref that we name in this template. So I've got one here called name, so I'd say dot name, and that gets me a handle now on this input field. All right, if this was called boo, then this would be boo. All right, so let me just undo that and call it name again, and we're logging this to the console when we click on the button. So let's try this out. I'm going to just make this a bit bigger on the right, click the button, and we can see we log this to the console. That's the element we have a reference to now. Okay, so what can we do with this? Well, we can do normal JavaScript things with this. We can do things like add a class, remove a class. So let's try this out. I'm going to say this dot refs dot name, and I'm going to say class list, which is a JavaScript property. Then I'm going to use the add method to add a class. Again, a regular JavaScript. There's nothing Vue-like about these methods. And I'm just going to say add the class of active. So now when we click on this button, we use the ref to get a reference to this element, and then we add the class of active to that element. Save it and try this out. We need to go to this element over here. Watch the class being added over here. When I click this, boom, there we go. All right, so that's how we can use refs. Let's do one more example. I'm going to say this dot $refs dot name. Then I'm going to focus it. So this again is a normal JavaScript method. When we have a DOM element, which is a form field, we can use the focus method on that to focus it in the browser. So let's have a look at this. If I click it, the focus goes to this input field. So there we go, dead simple. That's how we use refs to get references to different DOM elements. Refs also have another purpose, and you'll find that later in the course when we start to work with the composition API. But for now, this is all we need to know. So far then, we've seen how to take this single root app component and render it to the DOM. So if we wanted to, we could create an entire web page template inside this root component, and we could have our component object right here control any data or functionality of the whole template, and then we'd have our styles at the bottom to style it all as well. But if you're making a whole web page template inside one single component, then that will soon get to be a very large, hard to read, gigantic mess. We might have a lot of HTML for things like a header, a menu, a sidebar, some articles, some images, and a footer. And the component object right here controlling that HTML template might get big and unreadable too, with tons of methods, data properties, etc. And the same goes for the styles at the bottom. So it's not a good idea to put everything inside one single component or one single Vue file. Instead, what we should do is split our code up into different Vue components. For example, we might have a component for the navbar and the header. We might have a sidebar component for the sidebar templates. We could have an article component for an article we show, and we might have a footer component for the footer. Now this makes each component much more readable and easier to maintain, and it also makes our project code much more modular and reusable, because you can reuse components in multiple places in your website, and we'll see how to do all of that later as well. So in our Vue app so far, we have one component, the app.vue component, and this is known as the root component. Now, every Vue app that you create will always have a root component. Now, you can call it what you want, but when you create a new Vue app using the Vue CLI, it will always be called app.vue. Now, this is the component that sits at the top of the application structure, and it's the component that's initially mounted to the DOM. Now, ultimately, all other components we make will be nested inside this root component. So, for example, we might have a header component, an article component, and a footer component. So all of these three components represent a different part of the web page, and they are all nested individually in the root component. Now, inside those components, you might also have other components nested. For example, inside the article component, you might have a content component and a comments component as well. So this is how we structure our Vue applications. Now, I also want to go over a bit of terminology. When we structure our components like this and we nest components in other components, we call these ones child components and the component that they're nested in the parent component. And that makes sense, right? Same for this up here. The app would be the parent component of these child components. And also, this whole structure of components nested in each other that together make up a web page is called a component tree. Now, you'll probably use these types of diagrams a lot when you're planning how to structure your website with something like Vue, and we'll be using them for projects in this course later on. To begin with, we'll be keeping it simple and just creating one subcomponent that we can nest inside the root component, and that is going to be for a modal. Now, first of all, we can see that when we created this starter app with the Vue CLI, it automatically generated this components folder. And inside that, we have a component called Hello World that the Vue CLI generated as well. Now, if we take a look at this, it looks very much like the app.vue folder in that it has a template, which is significantly bigger, but it also has a script with an object inside it, and we have styles at the bottom. Now, I'm actually going to delete this file because I don't need it, and instead I'm going to create a new file inside the components folder called modal with a capital M, and this is a naming convention that I like to use. Whenever I'm creating a new Vue component, I start it with a capital letter. You don't have to, that's just my convention, but you can call it whatever you want, but it must have the .vue extension. And by the way, we don't have to put this inside the components folder either if we don't want to. That's just another convention. But you can place it anywhere inside the source folder if you prefer. But I'm going to leave it here for now, and I will talk a little bit more about folder structure later on. So inside this component, I want to create a modal or a pop-up which we can show in the browser. Now, to do this, we're going to need a template and also some styles, but at the minute we don't technically need a script tag. We might use that later if we have some data or if we have some methods we want to use in here, but for now we don't need it. So let's first just do the template, and then inside that template will create the HTML for this modal. Now it's just going to be a div, and it's going to have a class equal to backdrop first of all, and this is going to be the backdrop behind the modal. So you know when you have a modal popped up on your screen, it fades the background out. That's what this backdrop is going to be. We're going to make this kind of like a semi-transparent dark grey or black, and that's going to go behind the modal itself. Now inside that, I'm going to create a div with a class of modal, and this is the actual modal pop-up itself that appears on top of the backdrop. And inside that modal, we need some kind of content, so we'll do a paragraph tag for that, and we'll just say modal content right here. Okay, so that's our template, dead simple. Now I'm also going to create a style tag, and this is just to style these different elements. And I'm going to paste these in because I don't want to bore you with writing out CSS, but I will go through them. So we target the modal right here first of all, and we're giving this a width of 400 pixels, a bit of padding, margin top and bottom, left and right auto, so it's centrally aligned in the middle of the page. The background of the modal is white, and it's got a border radius to soften the corners. Now the backdrop is positioned fixed, and from the top is 0 pixels, so it starts at the top and it's fixed on the page, so it's always there. The background, we use RGBA and color it black. The alpha channel right here controls the transparency, and we're saying it's 0.5, so that's semi-transparent. And then the width is 100% of the browser, and the height is 100% of the browser as well. So that is our modal component right there. Now we want to be able to use this modal component inside our app component. So how do we do this? Well, it's pretty simple. There's a couple of different steps. First, we have to import this modal component inside the script. So you know, like we saw the hello world component being imported before, we're going to do the same thing this time for the modal. So I'm going to say import and then modal from, and it's going to be ./components/modal. So this right here, you can call what you want because we don't explicitly name the export, but this right here has to be the file name. And in fact, I'm going to say .vue right here. You don't need to add .vue, but I always generally do. All right, so we're importing this right now, and now we want to use it inside this component. So we have to register that we want to use this modal component inside this component, and the way we do that is inside this object right here. So I can come down here and say components as a property, which is an object, and inside here I can say modal like that, and that's all I need to do. Whatever you call it here, we can name a property right here. So if I want to use that in the template, I can just say modal like so, like an HTML tag, but this won't work unless I first import it and then register it inside the component. All right, so there's 2 steps before we use it, and then we nest it as if it was just another HTML tag. So if I take a look at this, all of this template now will be placed right here inside this component, so underneath the H1. So let's save that and preview this in the browser, and we can see it right there. So now we've created this component, we can use it in whatever other component that we want to, and we could use it multiple times if we wanted to. I could do 2. I'm not going to do that because that's a bit daft, but I could do if I wanted to. So it makes all of this code really reusable. Now, just a couple of things about naming your components. If you don't start them with a capital letter, make sure that you do not name them the same as a regular HTML tag like footer or header or nav, because that will cause a conflict when you try to output them in the template, because the tag will represent both your component and a regular HTML tag that already exists. However, if they start with a capital over here, then there will be no conflict. Okay then, so far we've seen that every component can have a style tag, so we can style that component, but there is one small issue with this. When we add styles in these, they don't just automatically apply to that component, they apply to every single component. So for example, this H1 selector right here, these styles will apply to this H1, but also if we have an H1 inside another component like here. So let me do that. I'm going to say modal title and save it, And this h1 style will now also apply to this right here. So let me show you that. And we can see this h1 looks exactly the same as the h1 behind. We have the underline, the font size, etc. So how do we overcome this? Well, what we could do is we could override that style inside here. So I could say now h1 over here, and that is going to have a color, and the color is going to be this hex code, which is a green color. And then I'm going to say the border is none, and then also padding of 0. So that's a different style. And if I save this now and come over here, we can see it's updated. But the bad thing is we can see it's also updated in the h1 behind it in this component. So because this style is further down in the HTML document than this one right here, it overrides it and it applies everywhere again. So this is no good. So the solution, well, there's a couple of different solutions. One solution is to say up here, I want these styles to be scoped. And if we add that scoped attribute on, it means that these styles will now only apply to whatever is in this component. And this h1 will not now affect any h1 in a different component. So let me save this and give it a whirl. We can see over here, we have the h1 style right here, which is green, but the back one is not affected. And that's because the style is now scoped to the modal component. Now, how does Vue do this? Well, if we inspect this element and go up to the head and into the styles, we can see in the second style, wherever that is, let me scroll down here to the bottom, we see another style. This is for the modal component. Notice that this h1, and in fact all of these different selectors right here, they have this data attribute as well, and it's a random data attribute. So Vue applies those data attributes to the selectors, and also it adds those data attributes to the HTML elements as well. So that's how it scopes it, because now this data attribute will not be in the h1 inside the root component, only inside this component. And that's how Vue scopes out those styles, because now it only affects the h1 with this data attribute in the style. Now, there is a slight performance hit when you do this, if you do it a lot, because Vue has to inject all of these different attributes to the different HTML elements. Now, it is very, very minimal, but I do want to show you a different way you could do this, and that is to just say over here, well, I'll make the selector more specific. So now, because we have a modal class, it's only going to apply to this h1. So you could add scoped here if you wish, and I certainly will be doing throughout the course in several occasions, but as well, you could just make the selector more specific. Also, if we go back to the app.vue file, what happens if we say that these are scoped? Well, these will then just apply to this template. Now, if I save this, watch what happens. Well, the h1 looks very strange, and the app itself is not in the middle anymore. Now, why is that? Well, it's because this selector now is no longer working, because this app div right here is not actually inside this component. It's in the index file over here. And because the styles are scoped right here, it's not working. It won't apply this style to anything outside of this component. So I'm going to remove that, and then everything should look good again. Yep, it does. Now, if you have any kind of global styles that apply to common elements that appear in multiple different components, what you could do is create a global style sheet inside the assets. So I'm going to call this global.css. And you could add in some different styles here. For example, the body. I'm going to strip out the margin that we have over here. So I'll say the margin is 0. And then I'm going to do one for a paragraph tag, and I'll say font style is italic, like so, and that will affect every component. So if we come over here and refresh, in fact, before we do this, we have to actually use these styles somewhere. Now, the way we use these global styles is by coming into the main.js file, and I'm just going to import, and I'm going to import that file. So it's / to say the current directory, then into the assets folder, then / global.css. And that's all we need to do. We're importing it into the main file, and now it's going to use these global CSS rules. So if I come over here, you can see that the paragraph now is italic and also the margin has gone. So that's how we can use global styles as well. Again, you might want to override this style inside the component itself, in which you could do. So I could just say modal P and then font style is going to be normal. So if I save again, it overrides that global style. So hopefully you've got a better understanding of how you can use these style tags and also scope them to that component only and make global styles which apply to various common elements across your whole application. So we have our modal component now, which is over here. But what if we want to now pass some data into the component from the parent component where it's nested right here? For example, instead of hard coding the header text and the content text, we could pass that data into the components from the app.vue component where we use it. Now we do this by using what's known as props in Vue, and we can pass props from a parent component to a child component. But first of all, why would we do this? Well, there are two main reasons for doing this. First of all, it makes components more reusable. In our case, it means that the modal component could easily be reused in different parts of the website for different things, because we won't be hard coding the messages or the content inside it, and instead we would be passing that data in as a prop. And each time you use the modal, you could pass different content into it as a prop from its parent component. Now, you couldn't do that if the content was hard-coded as it is right now, because then whenever we use the modal, it will always have the same content inside it. So using props makes it more dynamic and more reusable. Secondly, it means that if we have multiple components and they all use the same data, whether that be text or an array of items or something else, it means that we only have to define that data in one single place. For example, we could have two components in our application which need to use the same array of user data, for example. Well, we could define that array of user data in the parent component, so in the root component maybe, and then we could pass in that data as props into whatever components need it. So if we have two different components that need that data, we could pass that data in as props to both of those components. Now, this is known as having a single source of truth, the truth being the data. If we didn't do this, then we'd have to define the data in every component it's used in, which is not efficient. And we'd also have trouble keeping the data consistent across the app if it ever needed to change. So they are the two main reasons for defining data in a parent component and passing it down into another component as a prop. So let's try doing this with our modal. So the way we pass a prop into a component is very simple. We go to the component and we just add on an attribute. That attribute is the prop and it can be called whatever you want. For example, I could pass in a prop called header and set it equal to something. So I'm going to set it equal to a string like sign up for the giveaway. And now I'm passing this string as a prop into the modal component, and the name of that prop is header. So now what if I want to use this prop, this data, inside the modal component? Well, the first thing we need to do is tell Vue that this component should accept a certain prop, otherwise it won't know about it. And the way we do that is inside a script tag, we need our component object. So let me create that. I'm going to say export default and then the object, and inside here we need a property called props, and that is going to be an array, and all we need to do is pass in any values or any props that we will be accepting into this component. Well, we passed one in called header, so I can just say right here header like so. In quotations, it must be in a string. So now I can use that inside the template. So you know, like before when we saw the data function and then inside that we returned different properties in the object like title, and that could be something, we could then use the title inside the template. We can do the same thing with the header because it's now being accepted as a prop, but we don't need to define it in any kind of data function. We just automatically have it now because we passed it in over here and we registered it right here. So if I want to output the header, I can do it just like I would any other kind of data right here, like so. And now we should see this message that we passed in right here. So now it's no longer hard-coded, it's a dynamic prop value instead. If I save it, then we should see sign up for the giveaway. Awesome. So I can also pass in other props as well if I wanted to. You don't just get to pass in one prop, you can pass in as many as you want. So let me go back to app.vue and I'm going to say right here, another one called text. And I'm going to set that equal to a string. Grab your Ninja swag for half price. I'm going to save it. I need to accept it as a prop in the component. So that's text. And then I want to output it right here. So let's do that. Text. And if I save it, we can see now we get that text right here. Awesome. So that's how we create these different props. Now, sometimes it's not always going to be a string that you pass into a component as a prop. For example, you might want to pass through a Boolean, or you might want to pass in a number or an array of data. Well, you can't really do that inside these things right here because these are just strings. So for example, I couldn't say right here an array whereby the first element inside that is shown and the second element is 4. If I try to do that, that is not going to be an array, it's going to be a string that looks like this, and we can see it right here. So in order to do this, we'd have to actually data bind to this. If I was to put a colon right here, now this is an array, because remember, when we use a colon, we're binding to whatever data we want. Now that could be a data property down here, or you could directly create that data inside the quotation marks. So if I save this now, then over here, this is actually an array now, and you could do something different with it inside this component, like cycle through it. Now, I don't want to do that. Instead, I will bind to it, but I will take the previous value and store that down here. So I've just cut it, and I'm going to call this header, and that will be this value. And then I'm going to do the same thing for this. So grab that and say text, and it's this value, and then I'm going to bind to these and pass through the header like so, and over here I'm going to say this is the text and bind to that as well. And the reason I'm doing this is because first of all, it looks a lot nicer here, it's not as verbose, and secondly, we might have some functionality down here whereby we change the header or the text, and so it's easier to update what's going into the modal as props as well. So this is still going to work, all right? And this is the kind of pattern I'll probably use most of the time as we go forward with props. So let's do one more prop example. I'm going to add a third one, and I will call this theme. So I'm going to allow the developer to pass through a custom theme prop into the modal. And then based on the value of that theme inside the modal, which we could check, we could add a conditional class to style it differently. For example, I could say the value of this is going to be sale. And then inside the modal, we could check the value of the theme prop. Let me just register it first of all. If that theme prop is equal to sale, we could give this a class of sale and style it red or something to make it stand out. So it makes the component a bit more customizable as well as reusable. So let me do that. I'm going to data bind to the class attribute, and it doesn't matter that we already have a class right here. We can still add another one which we data bind to. We're not data binding to this because this is a straightforward static class, but now this is going to be dynamic. And remember, we saw how we output dynamic classes before. We pass in an object with key value pairs. The key is the conditional class that we might give it, and the value is going to be a Boolean. If it's true, then we apply that class. If it's false, then we don't. So the class name would be sale, which is the key of the object, and we need to pass through an expression. Now I want to check, is this theme prop equal to sale? Because if it is, then I want to apply this. So I can say theme, which we can use because we have that prop, and is it triple equal to sale? Now this is obviously going to be true if we pass sale in right here, and false if we pass something else in. So let me just test this out. I'm going to save it and inspect this element over here. We should now have that class of sale, which we do. We can see that right there. If we change this to something else, then we shouldn't have that class of sale. All right. So all we need to do now is style that class, and we can do that down here. So let me say, first of all, sale, or rather modal dot sale. So any modal which also has the sale class. I'm going to give a background, and that background is going to be crimson, which is kind of like a red color. And also the color of the text is going to be white. And then after that, I'll say modal dot sale, and then the H1 inside that, and that is going to be white as well. All right, so now if we preview this, whenever we have a sale value inside the theme prop, it should be styled differently. Let's check it out. Yep, and it looks different. So now we could create customizable modal components based on the theme that we pass through. If it's a different one, then it's not going to get that style. So this is kind of like the default style. And by the way, props are optional, so I don't have to pass it in. I could save it. Just because we accept it right here doesn't mean it has to be there. If it's not there, it will just be undefined. So this therefore would be false, and we don't get that sale class, as we can see. So that is the default value. And you can see how you could use this to create different themes. So you could pass in another theme which was dark to color the modal dark, and again you could check for that class or that value of theme right here to add a dark class. All right, so I hope that makes sense, and this is how we pass data as props into components, which A, makes them more reusable, B, makes them customizable, and C, allows us to have a single source of truth when it comes to data. So now we have the modal looking pretty good, but we need a way to be able to show and hide the modal. And to be honest, it should probably not show by default when we first load the page. So let me first of all create another property in our data, and this is inside app.view, and that is going to be called show modal. And to begin with, I'm going to set this equal to false. Now we're going to use this data property to dynamically output this modal. So if it's false, we don't show it. If it's true, we do show it, and we're going to do that by using v-if. So let me wrap this inside another div. I'm going to cut it here and say div, and inside that we'll place the modal again. And this time we'll say v-if and set it equal to this property right here. So now only when that is true will this modal show, and we can see over here it doesn't show by default. So what I'll do is add a button below this show modal, like so, and inside here we'll just say open modal, and I'm going to attach a click event to that and set it equal to a function which I'll call toggle modal. Now we need to create that function down here, so I'll do it after the data. So methods, and inside methods we need toggle modal. And then inside toggle modal, I want to just basically reverse whatever this is. So if it's false, make it true. If it's true, make it false. So I'm going to say this dot show modal is equal to exclamation mark, which means reverse it, this dot show modal. And that's all we need to do. Now it's reversing the current value. So if we click it to begin with, because it's false, it's then going to turn it to true. And then because it's true, we will show the modal. So if I save this and preview, if we open the modal, then we can see it right here. Now, just one thing I quickly want to do, because if we refresh this, we can see the button over here. I'll just add a BR tag, or in fact, I'll add a P tag and just say welcome. And then this is going to mean that the button will go back to button will go on to the next line. And we can see that now. So still works. Okay, so now we need a way to close the modal as well. And I'd like to close the modal when we click on this backdrop. Now this backdrop is inside the modal component over here. So how do we then fire the function inside here to toggle whether the modal shows? Because we don't have access to this method inside this component. Well, first of all, let's attach a click event to the backdrop, because that's what we want to click to close the modal. So I'll say @click and set it equal to some function. I'm going to call this close modal. Now we need to make that function inside this component, so let's do that over here. We'll do a methods prop, and then inside here we'll say close modal, and inside that we need a way now to let the app.vue file know that we want to close the modal so that we can run this function. So how do we do this? Well, we can use what's known as a custom event. So a custom event can be fired from a component, and then it can be listened to from the parent component. So, you know, like we have events like click events, we could create a custom event on the modal which we listen to. So first of all, we need a way to emit that event, and we do that by saying this to reference the component, and then $emit, and this is how we emit an event. And this is a function, and the argument inside this function is going to be the name of the event we want to emit, and this can be anything. It's a custom event, so it's up to you. I'm going to call it close because we're emitting a close event. We've clicked on the backdrop and we're firing this function, and when that happens we want this modal component to be flashing the close event, right? So we know inside this component we want to close it. So when that happens, when we click it, it's going to emit this event from the component, and then from the parent we can listen to that just like we would any other event. So just like we'd say at click to listen to a click event on an element, we could say at and then our custom event, which is called close, and set it equal to something. So now we're listening for this close event which we emit right here, and when this is emitted, when this happens, whatever function we reference right here will fire, because we're going to react to that close event. Hope that makes sense. So right here we want to fire this toggle modal function because we just want to reverse this value again to hide it. So I'm going to say toggle modal like so, save it, and come over here, and to begin with it's not showing. We can open it and we can close it. We can open it again and close it. Now there is one small problem. If I open it and click on the modal itself, not directly the backdrop, it closes it, and I don't want that to happen. So we'll combat that next using event modifiers. So sometimes when we're using click events, like we are inside the modal over here, when we're clicking the backdrop, we might want to modify when and how we react to them. For example, you might want to react to a right click instead of a standard left click on the mouse, or you may want to only react to click events if the user is also holding down a specific key, like the Alt key or the Shift key. Or in our case, with this modal right here, we only want to react to the click event if the user clicks on the element itself, the backdrop, and not on any child element inside it. Now, technically, if we click on the child element, we're still clicking on the backdrop because this is inside the backdrop. But I want to restrict maybe the click event to just this backdrop element, and not if we click on the modal inside it. So to do all of these things, to react only in certain conditions for click events, we can use click event modifiers, and these modify how the click event is registered and when we react to them. So let's see some examples. I'm not going to do this just yet. First of all, I'm going to go to the app.vue file where we have a button right here, and you can see we have a click event attached to it. So the way we attach a modifier to a click event is just by, after the event, saying dot and then the name of the modifier, and we can see all the modifiers right here. So for example, I could say right, and that would mean only react when it's a right click, and only then would we fire this function. So let's give that a whirl. Let's go to the browser. If I left click, doesn't work. If I right click, it does. Awesome. So we can do a similar thing, but this time I'm going to say dot and then we'll say shift, and that means only react to the click event if the shift key is down. So let me save that and try this out. Normal click doesn't work. If I hold down shift, then it does work. Alright, so let's do one more. We'll say alt, and this is the same thing. The click event is only registered, and we only fire this function if the alt key is now held down as well. Let's try this. Normal click, nope. Alt click, it does work. All right. So let's keep it alt, and let's say inside here alt, so we remember. And then over here, I'm going to do another event modifier or click event modifier to be specific, on this backdrop. And like I said before, we only want this to fire if we click on this element itself, and only this element, not any elements inside it. So to do that, we can just say dot self, and that does what we want. That means that only when we click on this, and this is the target of the event, will it fire this function. If we click on the modal inside that, then it's not going to fire that function. So let's save it and preview, alt click to open, and then if we click inside the modal, this still closes. Let me see that again. Yep, it still closes. So let me just make sure I've saved. I have done, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to hard refresh over here, open this again, and now when we click, now it doesn't close. So I just needed to do a hard refresh. It didn't pick up that change. So if it doesn't do that for you as well, just make sure you press shift and refresh to hard refresh. Make sure it's got the correct version of the code, and then try it. It shouldn't work. Okay, but if we click over here, it does work because that is the element we want the event attached to. So that is click event modifiers. We can have event modifiers for other types of events as well, which we will see later on. Okay then, so far we're passing in our modal content right here, the header and the text, using a prop, and we do that over here. Now this is great, and we can use props to pass all kinds of data into components, and we'll be using them a lot throughout this course. But sometimes we want to pass more complex information in terms of content into a component. For example, we have this modal which can be reused with different header messages and different text messages. But what if we had a form in one modal and we wanted some simple text like this in another? In that case, props don't really cut it. We can't pass a whole form as a prop into a component. So instead we can use something called slots. And slots are really useful for passing custom templates into components. They're not a replacement for props or an alternative really. They're specially designed to pass templates into components, which we don't do with props. And we would never use slots to pass data like a simple string or a boolean or an array into a component. We would use props to do that. So they're very different from props, and they focus on passing templates into reusable components. So let's see an example. So first of all, let's go to the modal, and no longer do I want to pass in the content, the header and the text, as props. So let's delete them from there, and also delete them from here. We can also delete them from where we register the props down here because we don't need them anymore, and save everything. So now what I'd like to do is pass in as a slot some content to this modal. Now to do that, we don't use a self-closing component like this. Instead, we need to open the tag, if you like, and also close the tag. And then inside here, we can just pass through a template like we would nest HTML elements inside other elements. If we have a div like this, we nest other elements inside. We do the same thing with our custom component, and the template that we pass inside here is known as a slot. It gets passed as a slot to the modal, and then we can use it. So let's just do a simple template first of all here, and I'm just going to paste this in. So we have an h1 and also a paragraph tag, and then if we go into the modal, we can use that slot over here. And the way we do that is by just saying slot, like so, and then close off the slot. So now what will happen is whatever we pass in, whatever template we use inside the modal right here, it will put that where the slot is registered inside that component. So let me save that and preview. Let's open this. We don't see it. So let me just hard refresh to make sure all the changes have been caught and do this again. Now we do see it. Okay, cool. So that is how we pass through a simple slot, some template into a custom component, and then use that slot inside the component. So now hopefully you can see that if we were to use this modal somewhere else in a different component, we could just pass through a different template, and then that different template would be rendered where this slot tag is. Okay, so it makes it really reusable. Now, as well as just passing in a default slot like this, we can also pass in named slots. So say, for example, I want to pass in something else into this component, but the component itself must have a very specific structure. For example, underneath this default slot, we might have a div right here, and the div might have a class equal to actions. And then inside this, we could have some kind of links. So I'd want to make it so that any links we pass in are placed inside here. Now, if I just pass them in normally, like this, anchor tag and then some link, they wouldn't go inside the actions div. They'd instead go right here. But if this has to have a very specific structure, like the links have to go inside the actions, we can use named slots. So we create a named slot over here by using a template tag. And this template tag could go wherever you want. It could go at the top up here, or it could go at the bottom down here. It really doesn't matter. Let's just create it at the top. So we create a template like that, and then close off the template. And inside the template, we could create whatever links we want to pass through. So let's do an anchor tag. I'm not bothered about the href for now. And the text is going to say sign up now. And then let's do another anchor tag. So A. And then the text can say more info. And then we need to give this a name, this template. So I'm going to say v-slot. And that is going to be links. So what I'm doing is using the slot directive to give this template a slot name, and I'm calling this slot links. So that's a very specific slot name. This is the default content for the default slot if it's not inside a template with this directive, and that always gets output right here. But when we use a named slot, that is not automatically going to get output right here, and I can demo that. Let me save this and then save this, and we won't see those links. If I open this up, in fact, I will hard refresh just to catch any changes, we don't see those links. So how then do we output a named slot? Well, we could come inside the actions because this is where we want those links to go, and we could say we want a slot to go right here. Now, this would be another default slot. We want a specific named slot. So we'd use the name attribute and set that equal to whatever we call that slot over here. So it was called links. So we'd say the name of this is links, and it will look for any slot that's passed in which has a vslot directive name of links. So now if we save that, hopefully those links in that template should be output right here. So let's have a look, open the modal. And it's not there. If I refresh and then open the modal again, there they are. We can see those links now. So named slots are very useful when you have a certain structure inside your component. So you don't want the user to decide the structure of the whole HTML you're passing in. You just want them to be able to pass in certain content, and then you can take that content and output it in different areas inside the modal if you wish, or inside whatever component uses that slot. So that is how we pass through slots and named slots. Now, one more thing, we can pass in some default content inside here. So I could say default content, and this would only show if we don't pass a default slot in, so some default content right here. If I come over here, refresh and open the modal, that doesn't show that default content. But if I get rid of this, let me cut this and save it and come over here, and I'm going to refresh again and open the modal. We can see now this is the default content. This only shows if we don't pass in a default slot, but when we do, it doesn't show. So that's a nice kind of fallback right here. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is to be able to style up the links inside actions. So I'm just going to paste in a few styles down here. I'm going to do it above the sale stuff. I'm going to say modal actions, align them to the center, those links, give them some margin and a color of 333. In fact, we don't need this color because it's being used down here for the anchor tag itself. Bit of padding, a border radius, a text decoration of none, and a margin of 10 pixels. Now, I also want to style it slightly different if we have a sale theme. So let me again pass in these things down here. So modal sale actions, the color of the text is white, and the color of the anchor tag is white as well. So let me save that and come over here, and if we refresh and then open the modal, we can see that looks a bit better. And if we don't use the sail theme over here, let me take that off, this thing right here, we can see they probably look quite nice as well. Open this up, yep, they look pretty good. So there we go, my friends. That's how we use slots to pass in custom templates into our components. Alright then, so it's time for the next challenge, and this one is going to be a little bit more difficult because we are further along in the course. And this time I'm going to ask you to create an extra modal inside app.vue. So another one of these things right here. And you need to use the same modal component that we have over here. Remember, this is a very reusable component, but you can pass in a different template as a slot. It doesn't really matter what that template is. You can have named slots if you want. You don't have to, or you can just have a default slot. It really doesn't matter. But we are going to have to use a different method to toggle this modal, or rather your modal that you're going to create, opening and closing. So instead of toggle modal, create another one called toggle modal 2, and that would toggle a different data property called show modal 2, because otherwise if you toggle the same one, it's just going to control this modal we already created. So that's the challenge. Have a go at it, spend some time on it, and then if you struggle, stick around. In this video I'm going to now show you the solution. So pause it here to have a go, and then press play when you think you've done it, or if you need help. Okay then, so now let me show you how I solve this. So first of all, I'm going to come down to the data and create a second property to show a different modal, and that's going to be show modal 2, and that will be false to begin with. And by the way, we can get rid of the header and the text because we're not using those as props anymore. So now we have this, we need a second function as well. So I'm going to copy this one because it's going to be very similar, paste it in, and I'm going to alt click after each one of these so I can update each one at the same time, and it's going to be show modal 2 and toggle modal 2 for the function name. Okay, so this is doing the same thing as this one, but it's updating this instead. So we're going to use this function to control whether the second modal opens or not. So now let's create that second modal, and I'm just going to do this pretty much under the second modal. So I'm going to copy all this right here, and I'm going to paste it underneath. Now instead of using if show modal, this time it's going to be show modal 2. So we only show this modal if show modal 2 is true. Now inside that, we still might want to pass a theme. We don't have to. I'm going to delete that so we don't pass a sail theme. So we have the default theme, and then I'm not going to pass in a named slot. And all I do is replace the text for these things right here. So I'll say sign up to the newsletter, and then for the paragraph tag I'll say for updates and promo codes. Alright, so that's pretty much it. That is the modal, but we also need a button to control the opening of this. So let's duplicate that one, and this time we'll say toggle modal 2. We'll get rid of the alt modifier and get rid of it there as well. And that is pretty much everything. We don't actually have to do anything else inside the modal. And that's what I mean. It's very reusable. We can use it in many different places. And all we do is change what we pass in, what props we give it, and how we open it. So let's give this a whirl. I'm going to save it, and then I'm going to come to the browser, and I'm going to say open modal right here. And we can see sign up to the newsletter for updates and promo codes. So that one's working. If we try to close this, however, doesn't quite work. And that's because if we take a look at this, when we say at close, we're still using toggle modal, not toggle modal 2. So remember to update that as well. Save it, and let's try this again. I'm going to refresh, open the modal, and now if we click over here, it closes that one. And let's try the first one, make sure that still works. Alt click. Yep, this all works. Awesome. Okay, so there we go. That is how you reuse a component in Vue. Dead simple. Now, one of the new features in Vue 3 is the teleport component. Now, this lets us essentially teleport some of our content that we make inside our Vue app to a different place in the DOM entirely. Now, this place can be outside of the scope of the Vue app itself. For example, it might be that in your website, you always have your modules in a div at the bottom of the HTML with a class of modules. So I could do that right here. I could say div.modules. And you might want to place all of your modules inside here, not inside the div with an ID of app where it currently resides in some component. So we can do this with the teleport component. We can say, okay, when you render this module, I want you to take it out of the context of this app right here, and I want you to place it inside this div right here. Now, all the functionality, all the interactivity, like the methods and the data, that will all still work, but it's just that it's picking that piece of the app up and putting it inside this div right here. So let's see how to do this. So the first step in our case is to find where our module is currently being rendered, and that's in the root component app.vue. So this div right here and this div right here, these are the two things that I want to pick up and teleport to this div over here. So to do this, very simple, all we need to do is replace these divs with the teleport component. And I want to keep v-if because I still only want to show this if this statement is true, and for this as well. And all we need to do is add on the to attribute to say where we want to teleport this to. And we pass in a CSS selector to tell Vue this. So in our case, it's going to be .modules, dot because it's a class. So we'll say .modules and save this. And now if we preview over here, I'm going to refresh so we get the new HTML page. And then I'm going to inspect so we can see this in the DOM. And if I close this, we see this is the div where we want it to appear. If I alt click this button now, hopefully, yep, we see it appear inside this modules div right here. Now, notice one thing. Some of the styles have dropped away because this is no longer inside this div with an ID of app. And if we take a look at the styles at the bottom of this component, we're targeting the text inside that div. So we can combat this by adding on another modules selector to this, or you could place it inside your global CSS, entirely up to you. And if I come over here, we can see that now the style remains. Awesome. And all of the functionality still works, by the way. If we click away, it still closes, even though it's in this external div outside of the scope of the Vue app. So let's try the same thing with the other module. I'm going to change this and this to teleport. Then I'll say in the top one, to equal to, and then .modules, save it and preview. And now this one as well appears inside this modules div. Awesome. Now, it's not just classes this works with. We could change this to an ID if you wanted to, and in which case we'd just change this to a hash instead of a full stop to say we're selecting an ID now, and this all still works. The only thing is we'd have to now change our CSS selector at the bottom to be hash modules instead of dot, and save that. And it should look okay now. So then that's this chapter complete now. Hopefully you're a little more comfortable using Vue files, templates and components. And this kind of workflow is going to form the foundations of how we'll be making projects as we go further into the course. Next up, we'll use everything we've learned so far, plus another couple of new concepts to make our first project a reaction timer.